Hey everybody, my name is Jim Farmer. I'm the festival director of Out on Film, Atlanta's LGBTQ film festival. This is our 35th anniversary. We have some amazing programming this year. One of our great documentaries is Jimmy in Saigon. I'm going to read a brief synopsis of the film, and then we're going to talk to the director. Generations after his brother's death, director Peter McDowell uncovers secrets related to Jimmy's sexuality and drug use. Jimmy died as a civilian in Saigon during the Vietnam War when Peter was only 5. Through hundreds of letters and a truth seeking journey that takes him around the world, Peter gets to know Jimmy and finds peace in his own life. Please welcome the director of this extraordinary documentary, Peter McDowell.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I am so happy that we're showing this year. This is an amazing piece of work. I guess, I mean, can you talk a little bit, Peter, about being increasingly drawn to to exploring your brother's life?
As you mentioned, he died when I was 5 years old. He was 19 years older than me, so almost like a totally different generation. But
Yeah.
he was just the first of six kids born in 1948. I was the last of six kids born in 67. And he was mostly out of the house when I was a kid. He was either in college or in the army or in Vietnam.
Hmm.
So I don't really remember him. And then, I remember when he died, I was 5 years old in the house, everyone was crying and screaming. And then my family was just super sad for like 20 years after that. And people didn't want to talk about it. So when I got to be older, I knew that Jimmy, he had made some films when he was young, kind of fun experimental films. And so I made a few fun experimental films in the 90s. And then I've been telling the story about his death, and people were like, well, you should really make a film about him. And so I stored it away in the back of my head. And then in 2010, 12 years ago, I started making the film. And I thought maybe it would take me 2 years, but it took me 12 years.
What was the hardest part about that 12-year journey to get it made?
Well, the story is kind of a detective story, and I had to find certain people. So I thought I would find people quicker than I did. But, making a film, making an independent documentary film, especially a personal documentary film, there's not a lot of funding available. A lot of people think that, you can get grants, but I raised all the money from individuals. I raised the money to make the film over $200,000 from 650 donors.
Hmm.
So I really, cultivated this relationship with donors all over the country. But the nice thing is that those donors then became fans of the film, and so we're just really glad to roll it out around the country. And it was, I guess, another hard part about it was meeting people that Jimmy knew, that I had never met, and then having the whole camera crew there is
Yeah,
just, I kept thinking like, God, I wish it was just the two of us and with no camera crew. And I'm like, well, then I wouldn't have a film. So you have to make a decision.
exactly.
Like, do you want this awkward meeting with a camera crew, or do you want the film? And ultimately, I'm glad I made the decision, because this is why documentaries exist, so that it can stay in eternity and people can always watch and learn from it.
Exactly. Obviously, I don't want to give any spoilers, but
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say that there was, certain discretion in Jimmy's life. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, he really, I think that one thing that really resonates with audiences is that he, if he was alive today, he would be 4 years old.
Mhm.
And that generation of sort of the Vietnam War era, that generation was really fed up with, a lot of them were really fed up with mainstream American politics from the 60s. And, he was definitely part of the cultural counterculture movement.
Mhm.
He couldn't find what he wanted in the US. And when he went to Vietnam in the war, a whole new world opened up to him, whether it was, um, you know, sex or drugs, or, other just more common hedonistic pleasures like food and travel. And I think these things weren't really appreciated in the United States at that time. It was kind of like all about work and family and sacrifice, and but also like more kind of conservative values that he didn't value. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'm a gay man, and I came out when I was 17, and it wasn't until many years later that my mom said, I always wondered whether your brother Jimmy might be gay. So I was intrigued by that and wanted to kind of follow that.
I read an interview that you did, and you mentioned I was not so much obsessed with how he had died, but rather the effect his death had on our family. Can you talk
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a focus a lot about, well, how did he actually die? Was
Yeah.
it a disease or was it drugs? And, ultimately I'm not sure it's that important because um, I don't think when someone dies young that you need to summarize their death as just a tragedy and that's it. Like, oh well, it's a tragedy, we're never going to talk about it. It's more like, well, what happened during that life? Like, if someone dies at age 24, what happened in those 24 years? And I just read a beautiful quote today by Jamie Lee Curtis where she was saying, don't complain about being old. Be so grateful that you lived to be the age that you did, because so many people don't have the luxury of growing old. And that's kind of how I feel about like honoring a short life. I mean, yeah. Mhm.
How did you get Dan Savage involved with this?
Oh, well, that's a good question. So Dan and I went to college together at University of Illinois. We met when I was 19 and he was 21,
Yeah.
a long time ago. And he was actually my first boyfriend, my first college boyfriend. We were together
Okay. Okay.
for 5 years in the 80s and 90s. And we lived all over the world, really. We lived in Illinois and Wisconsin, and we lived in Germany and Berlin for a year. And so Dan and I have maintained our friendship. And I made some films in the 90s, some short films that were in film festivals. And Dan encouraged me, and then he's like, you really should make a film about your brother, because he knew the whole story. And so when I ended up doing it, I reached out to him and I said, that thing you told me to do, make that film, I'm doing it, and will you lend your name? And so he came on as an executive producer.
This film is screening quite literally all over the world.
Yeah.
It's obviously resonating with audiences. I mean, can you sort of talk about, you mentioned earlier that it's so great to see this with the audience. But what's that experience like? Especially, for a couple of years we didn't have in-person screenings or people stayed indoors. But what's it like, getting to see this film with an audience and really just sort of seeing how engaged and so into it they are?
It's incredible, truly. Last night we had our Chicago premiere, and there's nothing like being in an audience of people reacting, and it becomes kind of contagious. And my film, even though it's about a tragedy, it has a lot of humor in it, and just to hear people laughing and even clapping at certain points, it's just really touching. I think it really kind of expands throughout an audience. And I think it's also fine to watch this film at home alone, or in a small theater. It's just a different experience. But yeah, it's been very gratifying to have in-person festivals. I was a little sad that we didn't get to premiere. Well, I mean, I wanted to premiere a couple of years ago, but I think it's good we didn't in 2020 or 2021, because of most festivals were virtual at that point.
Exactly. So what's next for Jimmy and Saigon?
Well, I'm heading to Ireland today for our Irish premiere in Dublin, and then I'm going to Greece for two festivals in Greece. One is a gay fest, and one is a mainstream festival.
Nice.
And then we'll be in my hometown in central Illinois, and then we'll be in New York City, and then Minneapolis. The film will be in Seattle and Tampa Bay. I won't be able to go to those, but yeah, and we're hoping to get the film on PBS eventually, and we're looking for distribution. So it's kind of at the beginning of its life.
That's amazing. Congratulations. That's such great news. The film is Jimmy and Saigon. It plays Saturday, October 1st at 2:30 at Outfront Theater Company, followed by a streaming window. The director is Peter McDowell. Thank you, Peter, for joining us, and thank you for this extraordinary documentary.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be part of Out on Film.
We're honored to have you here. Thanks so much.
Mhm.